Hey everybody. I hope this video finds everybody doing well. Um, Looks like things are kind of winding down a little bit here. We've got a few more weeks before we know exactly what our next step is. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to keep moving forward with the instruction. And so this video will pick up where the last video left off. We're working on our subunit called How Markets Work. And so this unit is kind of all about how businesses work together and compete against each other and how they're organized. So today's section is going to be on business organizations. And essentially, business organizations are just the ways in which people can organize their businesses based upon ownership. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be a little bit about how ownership structures can be set up, what the benefits and drawbacks are to some of those organizations, and kind of talk a little bit about liability and some of the legal issues that also come up. So you should already have the packet on this, the presentation notes. The first video covered the first part of those notes. This video will cover the remainder of those notes, I believe. And then once you're done with that, you can just submit these assignments. All right. So these are the major types of business organizations, and they really kind of vary in the number of owners and the liability of those owners. So the first one is a sole proprietorship. That's when you have one individual owner. So if you think a little bit about some of the businesses in Glens Falls or in the immediate area, or maybe even your own parents, may own a business and they are the sole owner. They're the only person that runs the business, and they get 100% of the profits, then that is a sole proprietorship. There are a few different kinds of partnerships. So simplistically speaking, a partnership is just two or more people who join together to own a business. But how that is structured and how that's set up, it varies from business to business. And so partnerships have a few different ways of kind of organizing themselves and sharing the liability or separating out the liability. A corporation, and there's a lot of different corporations. There are privately held corporations and publicly held corporations. We're most familiar with publicly held corporations because those are the ones that we buy and sell stock in. But a corporation really is just a way of creating your business to incorporate it in a way in which the business becomes its own separate legal entity. And what that does is it separates the owner out away from, or the owners out away from the business. And so the business takes on debt and the business takes on liability when it comes to those debts or for legal issues. A limited liability company is kind of a mixture between a regular partnership and a corporation, because realistically what you're doing in an LLC is you're spinning off a business or you're creating a business situation where the business takes on that liability. You can also have limited liability partnerships, which are slightly different. But what happens in this situation is that corporation, that company, realistically kind of takes on its own identity. And it has advantages in that the business takes on the liability, and you can kind of shelter some of the ownership aspects of that company. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about cooperatives. Cooperatives are really kind of like they're organizations, business organizations that tend to be nonprofit. They're not operating for a profit. They tend to be working to kind of reduce the costs to create greater benefits for their members in order to cut out the middleman. So cooperative can be a consumer cooperative, like a store, a grocery store, or it can be a group cooperative of people who get together with a central common purpose, like an educational cooperative for homeschoolers. All right, so let's get going through some of these, and hopefully we'll be able to get into a little bit more detail. So when we talk about a sole proprietorship, there's some pretty obvious advantages. Typically in class at this point, we would talk about, and I would ask, what are the advantages of owning your own business? And And typically, these are pretty easy to come up with for most students. But the real benefits are you get to do what you want to do with your business. You also get to reap 100% of the profits for yourself, right? So most of the advantages around a sole proprietorship and the ease with which you can start one tend to revolve around independence. People who really just want the independence and the freedom to be able to run their business the way they want to run their business. They don't want to have to discuss it with other people. They don't want to have a boss telling them what they need to do or should do. And so this is a business that makes sense for an entrepreneur who really wants to go off and have a little bit of independence. The disadvantages, though, are also pretty obvious. If you are the only person running your business and everything relies upon you, and let's say you don't have like a manager or somebody else that you can rely on, a family member or something like that, you end up in some very difficult situations if financially you end up in a hardship, if health-wise you end up in a hardship. So these businesses tend to be very fragile. First of all of the liability for this company falls upon you as the sole proprietor. So whether that's financial liability or legal liability, you're going to be responsible for all the debts, all the obligations, for seeking your own counsel, for paying for that counsel. All of that falls on you as the individual, and that may cut into your own private funds. So the business exists, but the business is not separate, and the business does not have its own funds. Every fund, everything that you own, your home, your bank accounts, your investments, all of those really can be drained in a situation with a sole proprietorship. The other major factor here is that because it's a sole proprietorship, and let's think for a second of a sole proprietorship where it really is just one person. That person does whatever it is. Like you are an accountant, or you have your own individual landscaping business, for example, where you just go out and you do this stuff yourself. If you're sick, if you're unable to work for whatever reason, you go without money. To a certain extent, like hairdressers. My hairdresser right now, thank goodness for her, she's saved up quite a bit of money, the woman who cuts my hair. But I ran into her daughter recently, and her daughter was saying how, the longer this goes on, the more difficult it is for her because she is unable to bring in any money during this time period. And prior to this, she had been sick. So she really, obviously, nobody was counting on this as being a problem. But she had saved because she had some surgeries that she needed, and she had some illnesses that were a little bit of a surprise for her. And, so it ends up being a very difficult situation for her where she is a sole proprietor who has to rely specifically on her skill set and her labor in order to survive without the benefits of sick pay, without the benefits of vacation pay and those kinds of things. When we talk about partnerships, there's three main parts that we're going to talk about. There's three different versions of how you can set up a partnership. The first one's a general partnership, and it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a simple arrangement between two or more people, and it's kind of like a handshake deal. All right. You get together with somebody who has a similar interest, a friend, a family member, a partner, whoever it might be, and you decide you're going to open up a business together. And the day-to-day operations of that business are kind of up to the way you negotiate things from day to day. Profits are generally split evenly, but you could come up with a different arrangement, obviously. But it's there's no general specific guidelines or outlines of how that partnership necessarily has to function. If you're smart in any of these partnerships, you're going to set up a legal contract that organizes your partnership and not just rely on the handshake and the goodwill of a friend or a family member at the time, because as we know from experience, these things fall apart, can fall apart. And when they do, regardless of your previous friendship or your previous family status and how close you were, a lot of times these things can kind of go south. So you're going to want a contract no matter what with these partnerships, but a general partnership is very simple, very basic, not a lot of delineation. With a limited partnership, though, here we're talking more about setting up a specific structure where at least one of the partners takes on unlimited liability for the business. So there's like a majority partner. And then there might be a minority partner, or sometimes a silent partner, somebody who's kind of in the background, who may share in the decision making, may have some tasks that they're going to undertake, but they tend to take a smaller role. So I know, for example, of one restaurant in town that is owned by two brothers. One brother pretty much runs the business. The other brother has an outside job, and he is an investor in the business, and he is a partner in the business, but his role is a little bit of a smaller role. He's dealing with decision making, and he's there at the business when he can or when he's needed. But his role within that business is more of a financial role and an advisement role rather than the day-to-day business of the other brother. And then with a limited liability partnership, what we have is when you get a group of people together who do a similar trade, for example, or have a similar type of professional practice. Good example for this one is a doctor's office that has multiple doctors. So someplace like Glens Falls Pediatrics, Adirondack Pediatrics, Iron Gate Medical. All of these are places where you have doctors who have joined together in a partnership and have a business structure that they all benefit from. They can work as partners. They can rely on each other as partners, but a lot of what they do is independent. So, a doctor, the biggest concern for a lot of doctors is going to be something called malpractice. That's when they make a mistake. It could be a decision-making mistake. It could be something that happens in the course of a procedure, but they face liability for their actions. And what a limited liability partnership does is it sets up a partnership structure where only that partner or only that doctor can be held responsible and liable for their actions, and it won't impact the other partners within that structure. So the other doctors at Adirondack Pediatrics, if one doctor makes a mistake, the other doctors are not going to be impacted by that doctor's mistake and are not going to be held liable financially or in any other way for the actions of that one doctor who maybe made a mistake and is being sued. Some of the advantages of a partnership. So we go from one person to multiple people, or two or more people. So the big advantages here are going to be similar to a sole proprietorship, where it's easy to set this up. It can be really easy to figure out who makes what money because of basically the way you've set up the system. But the real advantages are going to be things like you have multiple people being able to offer a lot of information. So it's not just on one person. If that person gets sick in a sole proprietorship, they may not be able to operate their business, but with a partnership, you have other people who can help out. The disadvantages can be things like unlimited liability for at least one person. Somebody's got to take on the liability of the business, similar to a sole proprietorship. The other major problem, I think, realistically, is this idea of instability. The idea that when you're dealing with money, a lot of things become more difficult. Similar to the idea that 50% of marriages end in divorce, which you could say is basically a financial partnership to a certain extent, or similar to these types of business partnerships where you have to work with somebody else. These businesses are pretty similar. They face a lot of the same problems, and they can really dissolve very quickly over some hurt feelings or bad ideas or conflicts between the partners. All right. Next, we're going to move on to incorporation. And so, again, when you incorporate, what you're essentially doing is you're moving your business off as a separate entity, and you as the owner or one of the owners, you're kind of moving your liability away from the business. And so if there's liability, the business has to pay for the liability. So it kind of protects the owner or the owners from having to be liable for things that happen in the course of doing business. So the liability is limited in the sense that it's limited to the business and not to the owners. And this corporation now becomes its own separate legal entity, and it has all the rights of a legal entity, a person. It can donate to nonprofit organizations, to political organizations. It can take on a lot of the liability and a lot of the structures of an actual individual, and it can act as an individual. So it excuse me, it creates a little bit of a system where that corporation can do its own things. Part of the problems with that, though, are things like the idea that individuals can then separate their actions off from the corporation. So the corporation, because the corporation's taking on a lot of the liability, the actions of the owners or of the management of that corporation sometimes can be shielded from having to face prosecution or being financially liable. These can be very expensive and difficult structures to set up. If you're going to be a public corporation, there's a lot of federal guidelines you need to go through in order to trade publicly on the stock exchanges. You have to present a lot of information publicly on a regular basis, every 3 months at least, or anytime that there's a major change, because your shareholders have a right to have access to that information. The other thing that I note here is double taxation. So the corporation is taxed itself. So whatever money the corporation makes, it's going to pay a corporate tax on. And then secondarily, anybody who's a shareholder in that business who profits from it will also pay an income tax on those profits. So there is a little bit of a double taxation that can take place here, which can be a little bit of a hit. So sometimes financially, this isn't always the greatest option for a lot of people, which is why a lot of people would probably be more likely to set up an LLC, where they get some of those separate liability issues spun away from themselves. But it's not really it's not expensive at all to set up an LLC, and pretty simple. Multinational corporations are the ones that we probably deal with the most, and these are corporations that have business offices and sales around the world. So multinational, meaning they're in many countries. These are most of the very large corporations that we all, we consume their products on a regular basis. The real pros to this is the ability to create this massive amount of opportunity, right? So you create jobs, you create wealth, both for shareholders, but also for people who benefit from jobs and from people in other places who maybe wouldn't have access to jobs. And then, because these are companies with a lot of money, they tend to be improving technology and be the kind of the leading force in a lot of what we do. The downside to the multinational corporation, though, is that they do tend to get heavily involved in politics, particularly in smaller developing nations. And so you even though there are jobs that are being created, a lot of times those are very low paying or low wage jobs that are being provided. And so it's kind of a good and bad with a lot of these corporations, the way in which they're structured and the way in which they, some people would say they're abusing free or cheap labor rather. Other people on the other side of that coin would be saying, but they're providing jobs where jobs were not being provided before. So real quick, I'm going to go through some other organizations. So I mentioned cooperatives at the beginning. These tend to be voluntary associations that cut out a middleman or provide benefits for the people who are members of that corporate structure or that cooperative structure. Like I said, food co-ops tend to be the most obvious, where you buy directly from a vendor rather than, when you go to Hannaford, you're paying a profit twice, a profit on the food that was provided, plus a profit on the company that's providing the food. With a co-op, you only pay for the food and you cut out that middleman kind of a thing. Cooperatives are democratically controlled. The members all kind of vote on how things are going to work. And everything is kind of spread out. So any profit that comes in is either spread out evenly or it stays right within the structure to further reduce costs on further profits. Nonprofit organizations tend to be those organizations that are doing community service. So in our community, we have things like the United Way, Big Brothers Big Sisters. These are the typical types of nonprofit organizations that aren't trying to make money. They're just trying to provide a service. And so they set up this structure where the organization, again, takes on a lot of the liability and runs and is run for a greater good. but the money that is made within that nonprofit organization stays within the nonprofit organization from one year to the next. And so you pay your employees, and you have wages and all those other things and benefits, but anything that's left over at the end of the year essentially just cycles back into the next year, and you continue to utilize that money for those purposes. Lastly, we'll talk about business integration, and this is when businesses join together. So these are either mergers or acquisitions. Mergers tend to be when two companies agree and come up with a contract to merge. And then acquisitions tend to be when one company takes over another company. Those can be either friendly or hostile. Friendly acquisitions tend to be pre-planned and people know it's going to be happening. Hostile takeovers or hostile acquisitions tend to be when one company gains enough shareholder stock to make a decision and push through the acquisition of a smaller company. And so you may have a situation where the shareholders of a company are not all necessarily in favor of this, or the management structure within that corporation is not necessarily for the acquisition, but one person or many people are able to kind of gather together enough of the shares of that corporation that they have an operating structure, they have an operating majority, and so then they are able to push through this acquisition. Mergers can be vertical, horizontal, or can be what's called a conglomerate. So I've got some examples of this. So a vertical structure is going to be when you have companies that all kind of do the same thing. So we have Warner Brothers, which merged with Time Incorporated to form the early version of Time Warner. Warner Brothers did movies and music. Time Incorporated did magazines and other publications. With the onset of the internet, AOL became a thing. And so then we had this greater merger of AOL Time Warner. So they took movies and music plus publications and online entity or online presence. So you can see how they're expanding. Eventually that becomes just what we called Time Warner. Again, kind of reverting back to the name, where they kind of spun off AOL as a separate entity, but the new Time Warner included cable. And so it was a way for them to provide all the things that they have ownership in to other people. But you can see they're all dealing in the same basic communications model. So it's a merger, a joining together of several companies that all kind of do similar things or different parts of something that all add together to one final conclusion. In horizontal merger, you have companies do basically exactly the same thing. So we have three different companies here: Exxon and Esso, which are essentially similar parts or similar companies, just in different geographic regions, and Mobil. All of these are oil and gas companies. They merged together to create ExxonMobil. They do the same exact thing. They just became larger. And then lastly, we have conglomerates. So a conglomerate is when you have a joining together of businesses that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And so here are some examples that I have here. When you look at these media networks, ABC, Disney, Freeform, and ESPN, they're all over the place. Disney owns all of these companies, and they've kind of joined together, and they do a lot of different things, but they'll have, they own baseball teams, they own hockey teams, they own parks like Disney World or Disneyland, they own studios, they own cable channels, they own pay to play kind of cable services online. They kind of own a lot of different things, and they're kind of spread out. And the idea behind that is, as one part of or one segment of your company may be losing money, another segment may be gaining money. And so these conglomerates kind of, it's like a don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of a setup. So businesses will integrate or merge for all these various reasons. It's faster and easier for them to grow. They can diversify their services or where they're providing their services. You get rid of competition as you join together with competition. Synergy is the idea that when you join with another company, you get like this big boost out of it, right? you kind of expand quickly and you get a lot of energy going, and you can create a lot more products and services. And then the larger you become, the greater your buying power. One of the major things that happens, though, is a downside to integration is a lack of opportunity. So one area where we've seen this would be airlines, radio, television, where you have, because there's been so much merger, you've gone from maybe 20 different airlines, major airlines, or 30 major airlines down to just 4 major airlines in the United States today. And I'm not talking about internationally, I'm talking about just American carriers. International carriers generally cannot provide domestic flights. So when you want to fly from one American city to another, you really are down to 4 major carriers. And a lot of the other ones, when we're talking about the major carriers, there are also discount carriers that are competing in a kind of a different market. But also they may be owned by some of the major carriers. So the concentration of the opportunity for consumers can lead to some benefits, but it also can lead to some drawbacks as well, as prices may go up. As the number of gates at each airport have declined, you have less opportunity for flights. So a lot of these things can change and provide negative impacts on consumers. So the last 2 things we have here are economies of scale, which is essentially the idea that the larger you get, the better you can operate within the economy, that you have much greater opportunities and a greater impact on the economy. And then, well, I guess that's it. I thought there was one more after that. So that's what economies of scale is all about. So these are the notes for the final notes for this unit. We'll probably be wrapping this up in the next week or so. And then we'll move on to one more unit. And then my plan for the end of the year, whether we're back at school or not, is to really just kind of work on a project or 2 that'll kind of sum up everything that we've been talking about throughout the course. So I hope this video finds everybody doing all right. I hope you're all doing well. And I hope to be in touch again real soon. Take care of yourselves. Be healthy. Miss you. Take care.